the stream is. And you can see that you are below the ordinary high water mark here, but all of this is going to start restoring, and it already was on that trajectory in just one season. So also important is that other types of restoration methods, ones that have been around for many decades, can also fit within SB 270. So I found that this particular guide, the Guidance for Stream Restoration by Steve Yoakum, who's with the Forest Service, is a great resource because it kind of covers from A to Z of stream restoration approaches, including traditional approaches like cross veins and J hooks and root wads and these kinds of things to increase the complexity of habitat for trout in streams. So those also are able to fit within SB 270. So at this point of the presentation, you have gone through just one category. So we've made it through this one, and the reason we spend the most time on that particular category is because it's perennial streams. And that is where a lot of the work is getting done. Not all of the work, of course, but a lot. And so it has the more complicated criteria. So we also spent more time on that. But now we're going to move on to another category that is also really critical and important work in Colorado that's being done, and that's in ephemeral and intermittent streams. And so we'll walk you through these categories, or the criteria, I mean. So here again is the language right from the bill. Stabilizing an ephemeral or intermittent natural stream by installing deformable and porous structures into the banks and substrate, which again, you see the same kind of criteria, which may incidentally and temporarily increase surface area or infiltration. And what this particular one was getting at is the problem with incisions in ephemeral streams, basically head cuts that are created by different types of problems that can happen. This one could have even been an old wagon road that started ruts. And so the water started going down those ruts and just cutting down over the years. It could be just an old ranch road, but there's different things that can cause and start that problem. And then if you don't address it and stop those head cuts, it eats up and destroys this beautiful mesic area in the sagebrush territory, which is so critical to wildlife and livestock in Western Colorado. So that's what this particular category exemption is trying to get at, is being able to do this critical work. And many of you on this call may have seen this type of work. I know Wildlands Restoration Volunteers is involved in this incredible work. So depending on how deep that head cut is, that will dictate kind of what approach you take to stop that head cut. So for here on the right-hand side, you see it's not very deep. It's like maybe a foot or a little bit more. And so one layer of rocks was enough to stop that head cut. And in 1 year, it's amazing. You go back to see this and it's all filled in with sediment and grasses, and you don't even see these rocks anymore. It's pretty amazing. If you have a deeper cut like the one on this side on the left, then you have to have a little bit more aggressive design there to stop that head cut. So here's another example of a project. And I wanted you to see that here's what it looked like in 2021 in August. And you can see the vegetation around it. So you can really get a feel for the grasses here. Now look at it 2 years later, just 2 years later. It's lush. It's really incredible that how well that rock held the soil and moisture in place and allowed this area to recover to what it was previously. So what's really important too is to look at what it is, the creek or the stream or the ephemeral drainage that you're working in, and realize it's something that at first blush, at first glance, might look like a stream. A lot of folks would probably look at this and say, "Oh, that's a creek," but it doesn't look like it's in that good a shape. The banks are falling in. Um, but in fact, this is you might have thought that maybe this is an intermittent creek, which is what I thought when I was first on the site. But then I started looking around and I'm realizing, oh my gosh, this is not a creek. This is a gully. This is a ditch that it not even, I don't want to call it a ditch because it's not a man-made feature. It was an erosional feature. So this is not even a stream. What this looks like just upstream from this is this beautiful mesic wet meadow. And now this erosional head cut is moving down, destroying this. And so it's really important to do that analysis. What is it that you're dealing with? And because that's going to dictate, not only the approach that you take to restore it, but also the criteria, which bucket does it fit under those 6 different categories. So in this particular case, what they did was put in some kind of really loose looking BDAs, or you can call it channel spanning pals. It really doesn't matter. But what matters is that it's porous, and that immediately went to work. This is just 2 years later, what this looks like from this to this in 2 years. So incredible work. And this is what all fits under SB 270. Here's another desert intermittent stream with a floodplain that formed many years ago and kept cutting down, and then it reformed a new floodplain down here from previously being way up here. And now it's cutting down again. And so they put in loose PAL structures that in that year there was a really good rain flush. So all of this debris you see is exactly what they had intended. They had hoped that those PALs would catch that debris and start catching the sediment and slowly grading this back up to reconnect with this floodplain that you see right through here. Okay, so now we've gone through 2 categories, number 1 and number 3. These are highlighted in blue because they are the categories that most fit into low-tech process-based restoration, which is a lot of what folks were really interested in when we started going down this path of creating this PowerPoint. And that's where a huge amount of interest lies. And so we did kind of call them out in the blue there. We will also touch on really lightly some of these other ones that are more high-tech process-based restoration, and you'll see why I call it that. So now we're going to go on to category number 6, installing structures or reconstructing a channel in a natural stream system. So again, that's really important because now you're working in the whole geomorphic floodplain, different versus just a natural stream. It's not the criteria is not the whole geomorphic floodplain. And you'll see why here in a minute, why that is. So again, the language right out of the bill. So this provision, again, provides huge opportunities to do low-tech PBR work in post-fire and flooding areas. Natural stream system is key. There are no constraints of ordinary high water mark or incidental increase in surface area. That is really key. And that is because you're working in an emergency situation post-fire. And so you need to be able to have all the tools in the toolbox to be able to deal with something as terrible as this. We've all seen that when we've walked up in areas, the Poudre Fire, the East Troublesome Fire, 416, around Durango, many different fires, and it looks a lot like this. And so in order to start healing that, it's going to be a lot of large woody debris because you've got all of this supply up here, right? And you can start using that to be getting wood back into this system, slowing those debris flows that are going to keep coming with the monsoonal events. So I love this picture from Wildlands Restoration Volunteers of one of their projects. And so you can see this is what they've done. They've basically stacked a lot of large woody debris into the stream to stop that erosional debris flow coming down, and it'll pause behind this and start reconnecting this incised stream, doing double duty of filtering out those pollutants and also reconnecting the stream. Here's another picture from the Coalition for the Poudre River. This is right off of their website, and they talk about Cameron Peak fire recovery to improve water quality. And here's the methods that they're using to get at that. Creating log jams, felling trees into the streams and nearby floodplain to create that roughness that will catch sediments, the Z-dike rock structures, and then plantings and pals. And all of these can fit within that SB 270 category. What about taking actions before the fire? We all know how important it is to be doing this work, not just after the fire, but before it. So we've mentioned that, and we talk about the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program that was created by SB 270. So in 2021, the legislature created this program to help communities plan for these events, these wildfire events that will likely eventually come to most people's communities that live in the more forested areas. And the main goal is of the program and the funding that was allocated to it is to assist communities in planning and implementing mitigation strategies to minimize fire impacts. And there's grants available from CWCB, and this type of work that we're talking about can fit in that. So what about improving drought resilience? When I did my research on what is the science out there on low-tech process-based restoration, I came across 2 PhD studies that were focused on determining if restoring historic beaver populations in upper watersheds could act as a second snowpack. You know how important that first snowpack is to us. If we had this as the second snowpack, couldn't that improve our resilience to drought? And the answer is yes, it definitely can, especially in rain-dominated basins, was what both studies found. So, okay, if you're going to do work before the fire, so pre-fire and drought mitigation work under SB 270, where does that fit? It fits right in those 2 categories that we've already spent a lot of time on going through. So that's where it fits. If you're working before fire, if you're working after fire, it's this one down here. And again, I show this picture because if you saw these trees, instead of being burned, if they were all green, well, then you'd be working under this one here, right? And when you look at this picture, this is not causing the water to go up and above the ordinary high water mark out onto the floodplain. So this project would fit under SB 270, even if this was not a fire emergency. Okay, I'm going to go through these next ones fairly quick. I don't know how many people are on the call tonight that do the higher tech stream restoration or are involved in it with the big equipment, but there is a category specifically for that, and it's very important. It allows mechanical grading of the ground surface along a natural stream system. So again, you're talking about the whole geomorphic floodplain in a manner that does not result in 3 criteria. Can't result in groundwater exposure, can't result in a diversion of surface water, or the collection of stormwater. So those are your 3 criteria. Many possible projects under this, especially what comes to mind is levee setbacks. So when you have large rivers, think of the South Platte, the Arkansas, other big rivers along the Front Range, many times those rivers have been hemmed in long time ago, maybe 100 or plus years ago, by large levees. And now there's opportunities to think about could we set those levees back a bit to recapture some of that floodplain and all the importance of that floodplain ecosystem services? So in this particular project I'm showing you, this levee used to be right here, right along the stream. You imagine that this river, the floodplain, used to be way, way out here somewhere, way off the picture, right? And maybe 100 plus years ago, it got hemmed into just this area. And so what that does is it sends all of the floodwaters down to communities further downstream that don't have levees. It causes problems. And so King County was like, well, what can we do to start recapturing that capacity to attenuate floodwaters? So they looked at this and they're like, well, we can move it back to here. We already got a park, a ballpark here, so we can't bring it all the way back here, but at least we can recapture all of this area. And so this is another project that was also done in Washington, the same situation. This was the stream or the big river, and the levee was here and here. And then they set it back to recapture all of this area, and look at it just a few years later. Just a beautiful example of what can be done. And so one of the ways that we try to explain this is floodplain recovery potential. What is the potential based on what are the situation you're working under? If you're working under a situation where you have a town, a highway, a railroad, you may only have a very limited amount of floodplain recovery potential, but you may still have some, just like I showed you in those slides from Washington. If you're working further out in the rural areas, this is what it's showing you. It's showing you you might have a lot more room for recovery. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick because these are all examples on the Front Range of projects that are possible. Is because again, the criteria are mechanical grading for floodplain reconnection that did not expose groundwater, did not create a diversion, and did not collect stormwater. And so this is showing you projects what that can look like on our bigger rivers in Colorado. In this particular one, I think it's really clear to see. This point here in yellow is this point here. And essentially there was this levee here that hemmed in the river. They took that levee out and pulled back the slope, put in woody debris, and now you've got a much more accessible floodplain than what you had before. Same thing here. This levee separated out what was the former floodplain. They took that out, and now you've got this great reconnection again. Daylighting a natural stream is another category of the 6 categories. And this is two classic examples what come to mind when you daylight a stream. So many streams across the United States and cities have been buried by asphalt and concrete. So you can, and this is starting to happen across the United States and other countries, such in Europe, and this picture is in New Zealand, where the concrete is removed, the asphalt is removed, and they daylight that stream. Of course, the natural floodplain is probably way out here, but this is a heck of a lot better than being under concrete. And this is what it can look like in Colorado, another example of daylighting, the Swan River restoration. This is really a mind blower to see this picture and realize that that was a stream that was completely buried by mining waste. They just completely tore up the river and placed all of the waste right on top of it. That's what you're looking at here. And there's been many, many years of work with a lot of partners to daylight that river once again. And that's what you're seeing here in this picture is it's daylighted. And then many years, hopefully you'll be able to come back and see this is completely filled in with riparian vegetation. So that is another great example of how you could use SB 270 to do work. Okay, so here's key. If a stream restoration project is limited to one or more of these 6 stream restoration activities, what the law says is that it does not cause material injury to any vested water right, and it is not an unnecessary dam or other obstruction. This language was important because that's another area of jurisdiction that DWR has to order the removal of unnecessary dams or obstructions. So that's why that language is in there. So this is the legal consequences, essentially. If you stay within SB 270, if your project is designed to stay in it, you get this protection of saying it is not, it does not cause material injury to a vested water right. I'm going to go through a few slides kind of quickly because of time. So again, this was a question that we had keep coming up over and over again. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. State law does not require stream restoration projects to be reviewed by DWR. That's because DWR does not have jurisdiction over stream restoration per se, like to review projects. That is not the case in Utah, Idaho, Wyoming. They all have in those states stream alteration permits. So anytime you're doing stream restoration, it's a joint application for a 404 permit and a stream alteration permit from the state. That's not the case here in Colorado. So that's why it's important to understand that it is not required by state law that you have your project reviewed before you go forward. And this is right off of DWR's website, this quote: "There is no statutory requirement to obtain input prior to commencing a project." And this is the website that I pulled that quote from. Another important point is that SB 270 did not change that fact. It did not create a new review or permit requirement under DWR. So that's really important. So I just want to make sure you understand that. Thus, it is up to project partners to decide if they want DWR to review their project prior to commencing a project. We have had DWR staff come to the SB 270 trainings, and they have stated that they would appreciate being contacted early in the process so they can give input and identify any issues that you may not understand or realize, because they're water commissioners especially really know their district, really know what's happening up and down the stream. And so they may know of a diversion point that you may not have been aware of, and you want to make sure your project doesn't impact that diversion point. So this is something important for every project proponent, project managers, and partners to think about. You have a choice. You don't have to, but it may be a good choice to go ahead and get that review. So this is what DWR's suggestions are. We asked them to put together a slide for us so that our folks that were giving this presentation would know what is on DWR's mind around SB 270. So this is their bullet points. They encourage proponents of projects to have informal discussions with their local DWR staff about projects. So what they're saying is that they think that you should go to your water commissioner first and have that informal early conversation telling them about your project, so that any issues that DWR, the water commissioner, may think about, they bring it up really soon, early on, before you fully designed your project out. Written project proposals submitted to DWR will typically be provided with a written response. The written response is not an approval or denial of the project, since they don't have the authority to approve or deny, but it's going to basically lay out if they have any concerns, or they may say, this looks good, we're good with it. But again, we're not approving or denying. We don't have that jurisdiction, but we're saying, we're letting you know we're good with it. Okay. What about beaver? We had a lot of questions off and on during the different training sessions. Does SB 270 address beaver-made restoration? No, it does not. It only addresses human-made restoration and projects. So that's a really important point. And beavers in their dams are a natural condition of streams here in Colorado, and CPW has management authority over wildlife. Those are all real key things on why this is a separate, different analysis than whether or not your human-made structure fits SB 270. Okay, how are we doing? How, Taryn and Nate, how are you feeling about time? Because I can either pick it up a little bit more or open it up to questions at this point, because we've really gone through a lot. That's up to you guys.
I think you could do either. If anyone has questions, you can put them in. There's been a few about, I think, fire and like what is considered like time since fire. Since specifically like do activities that you kind of attribute back to 2013 floods in Colorado that still haven't recovered, can you still consider that post-fire? Kind of what is the definition of that post-fire exemption under the legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question that we've gotten fairly often during these trainings. The bill or the law itself does not define emergency. And that was definitely on purpose, because emergency is going to look different after different fire events and in different situations. So generally what we've been seeing is that post-fire debris flows can last at least 3 years, if not quite a bit longer. So to give an example of the post-Cameron Peak fire, 2021 was terrible for a lot of the water providers along the Front Range. 2022, 2023, I still saw news events posted about the city of Greeley in particular did an interview with a reporter about how much they had to keep shutting down their intake valves still 3 years later. So for them, it's very much an emergency. And as we know, there's still much more work to do up in the Cameron Peak fire area. And so a lot of streams have still not been treated. So to me, that adds up to like, you're still dealing with an emergency situation. If you think about other events like the 2013 flood event, that is far enough away that I would feel more comfortable not using the emergency provision. I would use the perennial stream provision, the first one that we went through, and stick with those criteria. So it really, it's a judgment of value because it's not stated in the law itself.
Yeah, I feel like you probably get pushback from funders or like more than permitting, right? Because you have to justify that in order to get the money. I think we had a question too about, the specifics around what about beaver on this slide. Is there any, does it muddle the waters at all if you're kind of baiting the beaver to come back with your structures that you're building? Is that crossing any lines, since there was a project done in an area with the explicit intention last year of having the beaver come and maintain it, which is ultimately the goal, but does that have any regulatory implications?
Right. And that is another question that a fair question for people to be pondering and thinking about. When you read about the very principles of low-tech PBR, and in particular when you're working in perennial headwater streams where it was historic beaver and it's a good place for them to come back, that is the very goal, right? You kickstart the restoration process, the healing process, and you're hoping that the beaver come in and take over. That is true. And so what you have to analyze is what is your particular actions. Your particular actions are, I'm going to place maybe some PALs, maybe some BDAs, and other types of maybe large woody debris, different things along this stream, knowing that this is a place that I hope eventually the beaver come in and take over the 24/7 work that's needed. But it's what's measured under the law is your actions. What did you do? And your work, your project have to fit under those criteria, under SB 270. That, and then when you walk away from the project, as long as you've documented those baseline conditions, and then you've documented what the project looks with your work, you're within SB 270. Does that make sense? It's
Yeah, I think it's maybe hard to think about the fact that, yeah, if a beaver then touches their little paws on it and does any modification, like that is outside of the liability. So that there's a follow-up question to that too, like if they come and raise the water level immediately, is that any concern? And so I think what you're saying is, as long as you're the practitioner is not the one implementing anything that falls outside of SB 270, you're in the good. So we, here's a shout out to Beaver to come on all projects and have some sort of involvement to help us move these restoration projects forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best answer I can give you. Again, it's our opinion. This is all, the best that we can with the research and the involvement that we've had for the past 5 years and being in the heart of these issues. But again, it is our opinion. That's how I would interpret it.
Yeah, that's good news, I think. There's another question about defining the ordinary high water mark. And I think you touched on it with one of the slides where you drew like the incised channel and you had like where the ordinary high water mark is now, and then kind of where is the historical high water mark would have been. And so I think the question was defining it do you define it as the original historic location and then not the existing degraded location? But I think that slide showed that the ordinary high water mark, even though you can see clearly that at some point it was here, right, it would be considered where that annual or within a few year high water mark is. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're right. So that's going back to that slide, that first slide that showed those 3 different colors. You're going to be dealing with, where is it today? Where is it where you're now going to start implementing your project? But that's why that principle that I showed in that slide about the fact that it's not static is really critical, because we know that it will change. That is the whole point of the project, is that you want it to change. You want that ordinary high water mark to slowly, move up each year from that accumulation of sediment behind the structures. And so that principle is really important, that's recognized, that the ordinary high water mark is not static. It will move, it will change and come up.
Yeah, so maybe don't be discouraged by that fact that you can see maybe the highest potential of what that landscape could be. It just means that there's a few more steps in the process in order to get there, not that it's completely unattainable.
Exactly.
Over time. I actually had a question that may put in context like this whole legislation in the beginning of it, and I know Nate had talked about the need for it originally and kind of the conversations around wanting to have some legal backing behind supporting this work. And so I wonder kind of the context in which you all embarked on beginning this legislation. What was the need? Like what was kind of the concern in the future, and the context behind the beginning of this? Because I mean, this has been a lot of work for you all, and I can't remember how long ago that was. So
Nate remembers because he was there in 2019. when we started these conversations. I was at CPW, and as a head of the water resources section, this whole thing about PBR, process-based restoration, BDAs, came to my attention in 2018. And because CPW has an annual wetlands grant program, right, where you can apply for money to restore streams and wetlands. And more of those projects started to be this new thing called PBR, low-tech PBR. And so we were charged in the water section with, is this a concern around water rights? And so that was the first question, was there a concern around water rights because it looked different, right? It just looks so different than form-based restoration. So I wanted to understand the science and the law. So that was really the beginning of the journey back in 2018 to start diving into what does the science say? Does this impact downstream water rights? And what's the law? Should it be based on the science? So in 2019, we brought a whole bunch of partners together, and Nate was there along with a lot of other NGO and agency, both federal and state agency staff, to start having these discussions about how could we move forward with stream restoration in a thoughtful way that respects water rights, but you don't have to go and get a water right to restore a stream back to its natural condition that it was in before it was degraded. So it's been a long journey of trying to figure that out. And our state is not the only one that's had that long journey. All of the other Rocky Mountain states around us, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, have all had these conversations and all come up with their own path forward around water rights and low-tech PBR in particular. So yeah, it's been a long time coming, and fortunately there were some really strong leadership at DNR that saw how important this was to get this right and figure this out for Colorado, so that stream restoration could move forward without a water right, but having criteria, having sideboards on it so that it did not in fact impact water rights. And so that's what those criteria are all about under SB 270, making sure that this is done in a fashion that does not impact water rights. So I hope that explains it. I could spend, half an hour on that question alone, just going through the history. A lot of dedicated folks have been in on this, but again, it was DNR staff that really carried the day and brought it forward to the legislators last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an astute realization of the contentiousness around water and water rights and Western water law, knowing that as this grows, that will be a major concern that will come up and that you want to address, so that, both restoration practitioners and anyone that has the interest in their water right can have a stable leg to stand on and can feel like comforted in their work or what is being done, above where they get their water from. So I appreciate it. Thank you. We had a question. Can you provide some additional clarification on smaller BDAs being allowed under activity 1 relative to SB 270 language? The stream restoration project is not an unnecessary dam or other obstruction. I think the fact that BDAs contain dam in the name causes some concern for practitioners.
Almost need to back up the slides. Oops. I actually can do that pretty fast. I just want to go back to those criteria. So let's see. Okay. I think what they're asking about in particular is the criteria under this one, perennial streams. That's pretty much where you're going to be doing potentially BDA type work. And again, here's the criteria that are really critical: allowing water to flow downstream. So is that further defined somewhere in the law? No, it is not. And that's why it's really important for everything to get applied in a good faith way, right? And so when you go back, I'm going to go back to that picture that I showed of what I thought was a really good project here. Okay, so good faith. Is this allowing water to flow downstream? Pretty much completely. And yet you can tell that it's just effective enough. It's just got enough material there to start doing the work. If water rights were not a concern at all, let's say you are working in this stream and water rights just were not an issue. Could you build this BDA higher and get this stream to come up and reconnect faster? Yes, of course you could, right? But we're working in the West and we're working under the prior appropriation doctrine. And so that's what those criteria are all about. It's like, you can do this work, but you need to do it in slower so that you do not impact water rights. So you're going to need to build them less aggressive, like in this picture. I'm going to stop there just because if the person wants to add on any more thoughts or questions about that, I just want to make sure I answered the question.
Yeah, Travis, if you have any follow-up questions, let us know. I think in the chat that was kind of the conversation where it was saying, you know, yes, it does have the term BDA, but also by definition, it still allows water to pass through. So, you know, maybe our vernacular was wrong with that, or maybe, you know, we just created kind of a buzzword there rather than looking into it fully and knowing kind of what, when we talk about natural dams, that means specifically.
Right. That was the other thing that he asked, was about how is it not an unnecessary obstruction? It's not. The law determines that it's not an unnecessary obstruction under SB 270 if you meet those criteria. That criteria of it not damming up water behind it, that it actually flows through and is porous. And so that's how the law is stating it is not an unnecessary obstruction if you are meeting these criteria.
Yeah, it sounds like we're coming up with different different ways to talk about those structures, just to make it clear what the intention is, and that we're meaning to let water continue to flow through those structures. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I think it's important, if everyone doesn't know kind of a little bit about Western water law, and because of the context of this legislation being so based in, you know, prior appropriations or Western water law. And so I feel like probably you're better to kind of give a quick synopsis of that, but just that it is kind of first in time, that there are strict rules around priority use. And if you have or earlier date of a priority of a water right, you have legal right to it. And so anything that would impede your ability to get the amount and the same time as you would is a concern to water law here in the West, because of the way we structured how we legislate or how we govern water. So I don't know if there's additional information around that you'd like to delve in, but that is kind of the context, the crux of like kind of all of these conversations, I think, just in case people don't understand that there's like sidebar limitations that we have in the West.
You did an excellent job of a quick elevator speech on what is the prior appropriation doctrine in the Western states. You hit on the main points. And that is, in fact, you know, the main points that she went over are why you couldn't actually build a more aggressive, taller BDA that really backed up the water. And I want to skip to a picture at the end that really gets at that point. So let me go right to a picture that Okay. Take a look at the difference between these two BDA, and I try, that term is definitely needs to be replaced, but it's really hard to replace it because everybody knows it. So I was trying to use beaver mimicry structure as a replacement, but then I end up going back to BDA because everybody knows it. But look at the difference. Okay. Look at the elevation difference. Look at the pooling, the ponding here versus this. So I hold this up as an example of what's going to feel really comfortable, of how you could approach your design and be under SB 270. And this, like, no, that's not going to work here. And it may be perfectly fine where it was at. This is from Utah. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with this project. I just saw the picture and I'm like, that's not how I would recommend building BDAs here in Colorado if you want to fit under SB 270. But I'm not saying that that didn't do its job or that it wasn't perfectly fine in that situation. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about that.
Right, that there's a lot about appearance of like doing due diligence in order to stay under the parameters of SB 270, and you don't want to put yourself in a situation where there could be concern about it. So just make it clear from the beginning, like this is porous, it's not an obstruction, it's not a unnecessary dam structure. We had a question around, is hydraulic modeling often necessary for small projects to prove a no rise of the ordinary high water mark, which is a good question. I will expand on that and wonder if there is wetland delineation that is often needed in order to define high water mark, or is that again doing your due diligence to kind of have justification behind where the high water mark is, or is there kind of more stringent qualifications that are necessary?
Okay, I'm going to go back to, let's see, another slide. Okay. So what we're getting at here is documentation. Documentation prior to your project commencement. You really need to document your baseline conditions. Where is that ordinary high water mark? And being able to delineate that and have pictures of it. Of, along pretty much your whole point. If you're doing a mile stream, maybe you take pictures every 50 feet, but you really need to delineate that and document it so that if it is questioned after the fact, you're able to pull those pictures out and show it. Drone imagery would be another great way to do that if you're working in a pretty big stretch. Then you need to figure out your best estimate of how the proposed restoration methods and project design will conform to SB 270. So you've got, let's just stick with that mile reach. And in that mile reach, you may be doing a whole different approaches. Maybe you're going to do some large woody debris. Maybe you've got a lot of downed wood timber that was burned, and you've got a lot of wood to work with. So maybe you're going to do a lot of large woody debris. Maybe in other places you feel like the BDA is the right approach, and other places you may feel like PALs are. So you just need to be thinking through, like, with your practitioner that you've hired is like, what is this going to look like? When we put this in, when we're back at base flow, because you're mostly going to be putting this in when you're at base flow. You're not going to be putting it in when you're at really high spring runoff, right? You're going to be working in base flows. So that's where you need to be looking at, okay, in base flows, where's the ordinary high water mark? And now we're going to be able to put these structures in, and we cannot rise the stream above that. So that's what you're going to have to document and be thinking about. And then after you actually install the project, then again, you document that, so that you have this comfort level of, like, we did everything we needed to do to show that we fit under 270.
So both, I think that maybe the answer to that question is it's not necessary and might be overkill as long as you are documenting the high water mark before and after the work.
Mhm.
So maybe
Yeah,
not, yeah, maybe not as stringent as that.
part of the question that I heard went a little bit towards 404 permitting requirements, because the question also seemed to ask about, do you need to delineate wetlands? Was that also
Yeah,
part of
that was my add-in. That's been a conversation
okay.
I've had with other people, like, do you have to have a professional come in and, have proof and say like soils here or vegetation and, many markers to make the case for ordinary high water mark? Or I guess like how far do you have to go is kind of that I added that second part. The hydraulic modeling was the original question, but I just wanted to know like how exact, or like how much paper trail or how much expertise needs to go into proving that
Yeah,
ordinary watermark.
it really kind of depends on the situation and your partners and the comfort level of the folks that you're working with and the landowner that you're working with. Best case would always be to have a professional practitioner that is used to delineating ordinary high watermark. And there's quite a few of them here in Colorado, because that is part of the 404 analysis. If you're going to go above the ordinary high watermark and impact wetlands with fill, right? That's often part of that analysis if you're going to have to mitigate for wetland loss. So there's a lot of folks that are in Colorado that actually are familiar with delineating the ordinary high water mark for kind of a different reason, not for stream restoration. That wasn't why that they were doing it. They were doing it for the analysis of wetlands impact, potential wetlands impact, and whether or not you're going to have to mitigate, et cetera, under the 404 program. So there are folks that know how to do that. So I would say, as long as you have a professional that is familiar and has experience in delineating the ordinary high watermark, then that would be part of what you do as your project, creating your baseline, right, of conditions.
Yeah, I think John brought up that there is a ordinary high watermark delineation training available, as well as the publication that you referenced, that Ellen Wool was a part of, that you drew out, which is awesome because she's the speaker. She's the next speaker series speaker. So someone had a follow up. So the main criteria is that base flows do not rise above the high water mark. High flows potentially being over the high water mark does not matter.
Right, because you're not going to be doing this work in high flows. Because if you did, then you're immediately going to send it out and over the ordinary high water mark. It makes no sense. You're going to be doing this at base flows.
Right. I realize that there's a Q&A section. I was looking at the chat, but someone asked, it's important to save burn trees to create the log jams rather than burn them, as being done in Rocky Mountain National Park. Do we change their practice? And I wonder if you're talking about pile burning or what that's in reference to, because I know there are a lot of burned trees in a part of the national park. So I might have to ask for a clarification on that question.
Yeah, because I wasn't quite understanding the question there.
Yeah, maybe a concern with like a lack of materials for the structures. But I do know it's, burn trees are used in these structures, but sometimes they're a little unruly because they're lighter. And so sometimes, especially in Rocky, because the whole area didn't burn, you can also, I mean, hypothetically, we haven't worked in the park yet, so I'm not sure how they handle gathering materials, but you could also then gather live materials from other areas and bring those in if there's not enough burned wood.
One thing that folks are really looking for opportunities now are combining forest fuels mitigation work with stream mitigation work. So there's a lot of partners that are in the Riverscape Restoration Network that I'm familiar with, that they are looking for those opportunities. How can we both work together? You go and thin trees for, fuels, fire risk reduction. We can use those materials in our doing our stream work. So that's something that's just starting to, I've heard more and more stories about that starting to happen, which is great.
Yeah, it's a good efficient use of materials, right? You don't have to truck them off anywhere. You can just use them on site and kind of saving cost and probably emissions in order to pair those together. So we have Travis is coming in with the hard questions here. Let me try to get to it. If the project is in a regulatory floodplain per CWCB's higher floodplain standard rules, if the project increase or decrease water surface elevations by plus or minus 0.3 feet, you would need to submit a LOMR. It would be hard to prove that a project wouldn't cause a change without modeling. Hope CWCB will provide some additional guidance on LTPBR projects soon. I guess that's not a question, it's just a comment.
Yeah, no, it's a comment of it is really it's like the next frontier of what to figure out here on these FEMA no rise rule. For folks that are doing work within areas that are FEMA mapped. This is really only applies to where there's mapping. So a lot of the work that's happening up in the headwaters, there's no FEMA mapping up there. And so we don't have that no rise rule to contend with. But when you're down in the lower elevations, and certainly all along the Rocky Mountain front, that is an issue that more and more folks are starting to talk about and try to contend with. Like, it's unnatural where that river is right now, and if you aren't able to allow it to rise back up and reconnect with its floodplain, that's problematic. And so I think that will be something that's really got to be worked out over the next few years in particular. But agencies, federal agencies are talking about it. They're aware of it. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, it's funny, the things that come out of the woodworks as these like new practices come into use, and the the ramifications in areas that you wouldn't normally think of. So the legislation is addressing kind of one question of water rights, and other FEMA regulations will have to be the next frontier, I guess. Yeah, and John mentioned that that's for 100-year floods. So that's pretty in the weeds if that's if that's not something you're all aware of. But I think that all of this is really highlighting, and why I really appreciate you coming to have this conversation, that a lot of people on this call are coming from volunteers or just kind of interested in the restoration world. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, you see the projects on the ground, or you see them go in, or you see these really great before and after photos that Jackie showed, but the conversations and the permitting and all of the work that came before the implementation, you're kind of seeing this behind the curtain here with this legislation as to what are practitioners thinking about, what are the limitations, what might change how projects are implemented. And this legislation is one, water rights are one, FEMA regulations are another one, and just landowners would be, there's like endless, right? So just kind of a shout out that there's a lot of work that goes into not only this legislation and defining it, but all the work that's being done behind the scenes before you see even the project on the ground.
I am going to just skip to this slide for a moment so folks can pause and take that in if they haven't seen this yet. This is a slide that has taken many years to develop this. This is many, many conversations with stream restoration practitioners across the West who are implementing low-tech PBR type projects, and sometimes bumping into water rights issues, and they're like, well, that didn't work. There's a lesson learned there. Let's turn that into a best management practice, a BMP, that we avoid that problem in the future. And so a lot of those conversations led to this list. This list is fleshed out even further in the paper that the low-tech process-based state of the science paper that I've worked on for the past couple of years. So it's fleshed out even more, but here it is in one slide to go through and just look at and be considering for projects, kind of a starting point, really kind of whether you're working under SB 270 or whether you're trying to think about, do I need to be outside of 270 to meet my project goals? Either way, these are good things to be thinking about. And so if folks want to take a screenshot of that, feel free. We can also share this slide with the folks that signed up. Any more questions coming in?
Not yet that I see, but I am going to relink that paper that Jackie just referenced and the updated version that came out very recently, I think. So it's January 2024, so it's as up to date as this year. And there's a lot to dive into there. I think a lot of these questions you can look into there and kind of see the research that Jackie delved into that kind of define the benefits of this work and address kind of those concerns and questions that people have come up with around the work. So if you want to be a well-informed citizen, that's a great way to go about it. We do have one. What about including changing environmental factors in planning/monitoring for adaptive management? Do you mean in terms of how the legislation covers changing environmental factors in planning and monitoring?
I'm going to guess that they're getting at climate change impacts to flows, because I had another conversation earlier today about that. Like, what about, we know it's happening here. We know that we're getting less snow. We know that our hydrographs are shrinking. How does that all fit in with this work and SB 270? And again, it goes back to your project is dealing with the conditions that you have at that moment in time. You cannot predict the future and then and try to target something that's not here yet. So you need to think about what are the conditions I'm dealing with. You can see the trends of what has been happening in that basin, so you kind of know where we're headed. But right now you're dealing with your conditions, and it just is an argument so much more for this work, because we know that's where we're trending. We know we're trending less snow, hotter temperatures, less flow. But if you reconnect that floodplain, it's going to be so much more resilient to those trending impacts than if it's a degraded incised stream. So I don't know if I answered your question perfectly or right as just as you were thinking, but yeah, it's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it sounds like we can't react in the we would want to in order to respond to what can come, but we are dealing with what we have right now. And That's why we're doing this work. I think there's a good, just to fit one more in, kind of what is the, what are some additional call to action or engagement the average citizen can do to support this work? And maybe I'll expand that to support kind of legislation that allows us to do this work. Is there a place for the average person to play a role?
Well, there's so many different ways, so many different points for folks to get involved in this, really depending on how much time you have and what what your skills and interests are. So many different volunteer ways to get involved, and we try to post those every, it seems like about May. We get a list of all of the different volunteer opportunities that are lining up to do this kind of work. If that's what you're interested, kind of getting into the stream and being a part of installing one of these projects, we do try to put together a list of that and send that information out to folks so they can line that up in their calendars. So there's that type of work. Then there's just the education work is so critical. There's so many different aspects of education around why do we need beavers back in our watersheds? Like so many opportunities to talk at many different levels. I was invited a month ago to sit on a panel of 3rd and 7th grade students that had been given a problem solving, real world problem solving around beaver. Beaver had moved into the creek right on school property and were causing flooding. And so here was the students being given this real world problem to delve into, research, and then present their, what they came up with to a panel of experts. And that was just an incredible opportunity. And so there's opportunities to get involved with your kids at school and talking to teachers about this. So there's all different levels of education to get involved with, and then supporting your organization of choice that's doing this kind of work is another great way to get involved. So yeah, I would say many, many different opportunities. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, and is that the Healthy Headwaters Working Group? Is that where you reference that gets the, okay, I'm gonna link their webpage here. And I do want to respect everyone's time. It's getting late. Want to thank Jackie so much for joining us today. There's so much valuable information to come out of this conversation. And, I know everyone is kind of moving into the summer. We're going to be seeing these projects implemented. So look out for those opportunities, talk to your neighbors. I know we got a lot of people that are vocal, so keep being vocal about your support of all this work. Thank you again, Jackie. We look forward to kind of seeing where this all goes. Appreciate all that time and effort you all put into passing this and working on it through the years. So thanks everyone for joining too.
And thank you guys so much for organizing this. What an incredible series that you put together. And once again, so sorry that I was late. And thanks everybody for hanging in there. That was awesome. Getting all of these questions, such a great interactive audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And don't forget, next Tuesday, if you haven't already signed up, Ellen Wool, there's an opportunity in person, New Belgium, or online. So we'll see y'all there, hopefully. Night.
Thanks, you guys. And if you could capture the chat, that would be great. I'd love to see that and see if I missed things, and I can always send some more answers later on.
It should be in the recording. I think it captures the chat, so we'll send that to you, Jackie.
Okay, awesome.
Great, cool. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.